Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another edition of the newscast. We've got some breaking news coming out of the region today that will be the subject of a podcast later this week. But before we get into that, let's do a rapid-fire tour of all the other major hotspots in Europe right now. Russia continues to mobilize reservists and hold military exercises in Belarus, and so that has raised fears in Eastern Europe that there could be a renewed Russian offensive through Belarus into Ukraine, or simply an attempt to distract Ukrainian forces from the front lines in the Donbass where most of the fighting is taking place right now. So far, there are no signs of such an attack. And we're going to talk about what Russia's strategy really is behind the mobilization of reservists and their actions in Belarus on the podcast later this week with a special guest. So stay tuned for that. The war in Ukraine rages on. There were missile strikes overnight on both sides. A number of Ukrainian missiles have reportedly struck the Kursk nuclear power plant. And there are unconfirmed reports that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant has also come under attack. We don't know who carried out these attacks, and it's really important when we're talking about nuclear power plants that they are not the same as nuclear weapons. But nonetheless, these attacks are dangerous. They raise the risk of a nuclear accident, and they are yet another escalation in this conflict. So we'll see where things go there. But the war rages on. There are continued attacks in the Donbass. There are increased attacks around Kharkiv, and it seems like Ukraine is trying to hold the line while they wait for additional supplies, particularly from the United States. Congress has approved another $40 billion in assistance for Ukraine. Half of that will go to military assistance, the other half to economic and humanitarian assistance. Hybrid, cyber, and non-traditional threats continue to make headlines. We had a cyber attack on the Polish parliament just a few days ago. And there was an unexploded bomb found at the Russian embassy in Poland earlier this week. And so these kinds of actions, whether they're carried out by state actors or non-state actors, raise the risk of miscalculation and escalation. So we continue to monitor them closely. Energy security remains a major concern as well. Russia continues to use energy as a weapon, reducing gas supplies to various European countries. And this is raising fears of energy poverty, particularly in Eastern Europe. I'm very concerned about the impact of the war in Ukraine on the poorest countries in Europe, particularly in the Western Balkans where I work a lot. And I'm going to be writing a piece in the coming weeks about how Europe needs to think beyond just energy security and recognize that food and economic security are just as important in the Western Balkans. So stay tuned for that as well. EU and NATO strategic autonomy versus US dependence is a major topic of discussion in Brussels right now. Many European leaders are calling for a more independent European defense and security policy. And this was the subject of a major speech by Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas just a few days ago. She argued that Europe can't rely on the United States and needs to invest in its own defense and move away from its overdependence on American military support. Speaking of which, the Western Balkans. The other major regional hotspot right now is the Western Balkans, where Serbia is continuing its crackdown on civil society. Organizations, particularly those that receive funding from abroad, and this has raised fears that Serbia could be moving towards autocracy and away from democracy. And this really is a major issue because the Western Balkans are a geopolitical priority for us here in Europe, and we need stable, secure, and democratic partners in the region. And so we're going to continue to follow developments there closely. There are also concerns about the EU and NATO's eastern neighbors, in particular Turkey, where President Erdogan has been consolidating power and cracking down on dissent. And then there are concerns about the situation in Iran, where the nuclear talks seem to be going nowhere, and the Iranian government is becoming more and more radical. Finally, there are several diplomatic crises in the making. First, the P5+1 talks over Iran's nuclear program appear to be at a standstill. World powers are struggling to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. And this raises the risk of Iran's nuclear program and the risk of conflict in the region. There's a diplomatic crisis between Qatar and a number of Arab states. Now, this has been going on for a while, but it escalated last week when the Qatari government accused the UAE and Saudi Arabia of a plot to assassinate its former prime minister. And then thirdly, North Korea conducted another ballistic missile test just a few days ago. This is part of a recent uptick in missile tests by North Korea. And this raises concerns about the country's nuclear program and the risk of conflict on the Korean peninsula. So lots going on out there. Again, if you want to dig deeper into any of these topics, check out our podcast later this week. We'll be back next week with another roundup. Until then, thanks for watching and take care.